Okay, so it should be recording now. So anyway, this is our function. Do a main function, get our commands, and then we call the function. Seems like there's something else I was going to say before I started recording, but as I said, I will post this on the blog, all the code that we do in class today. Plus, there should be the video that's starting a little late. But so I'm going to go to run, and I'm going to say run module. And it's going to tell me that I need to save it again, right? Because it has to be saved before it can run. So if I say OK, it goes, notice it goes back to the interactive screen. And if that screen hadn't been opened, it would have opened one, right? It would have opened a separate little window with the interactive. So I'm going to do, well, I'm bored with Steve. Let's do, I have no idea. I don't want Bob. Nathan. Anybody know a Nathan? All right. So the program executed now, but it's executing from the file. Did you have problems? Or?
Oh, I just got an error message.
Well, what error did you get?
The word your.
Oh, all right. So how did you do your?
Y-O-U-R.
And the quotes are in there. Let me look. I do want to show you some error messages, actually. You need quotes.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, you need a quote in front of it. The reason why it would hit the second name is that the first one is sort of assuming is something. So like if I take the quotes off, let's go back to the other one actually. Because that's actually an important thing to know and to work with is errors. And come on, give me this one. Let's just take the quotes off of this. All right, so it's no longer a literal string, and it's going to be confused because if it isn't in quotes, then it assumes it's some kind of variable or command, right? It basically assumes that it's some kind of variable or command. And when I run it, first I'll have to save it. So let's do file save. And then if I run it, I will get an error. And it says it's invalid syntax. And it highlights your because that's the first word after a space. It just doesn't know what to do with this. The thing is, if you look for like name equals input, that in parentheses, that all looks good. The invalid syntax is basically the quotes. This error messages are usually pretty good, but not always good. Does that make sense? They usually get you in the general area of the error, but they don't necessarily give you the exact error. I think now I'm just trying to think of what if I could make another error here. If I do something like this, it may throw an error. Let's see. Let's save it again. Control S saves it. If you prefer, F5 runs it. So if I enter the name Joe and I run that, then I get an error. And basically the gist of it is down here. Name 2 is not defined. Right? So errors kind of look like this. They go through, they tell you that it happened in line 12. Actually, line 12, I'm not sure where that is. It happens in line 9. This is line 12 is where main is called. That's where the program actually starts executing. And then on line 9 in the main, it finds name 2, and the error is name 2 is not defined. I wonder if we can get line numbers. Let's go over here. under options, configure idle.
Showing it at the lower right corner.
Lower.
Right corner of the where you run the main window.
Like on your page.
On the page?
Yeah.
Well, it does that, but I was thinking line numbers in the page itself.
Like an indentation.
Well, so like in Visual Studio and a lot of things, you can put line numbers so that it's easier to figure out what line you're on when you go look for the, like when it counts to line 9 for this, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counts the spaces too. It's just 9 from the top. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it would be nice to have numbers along the margin for that. All right, so it doesn't recognize name 2. And that's, that's what the error is. It was right on for that error. When you correct an error, then you can save it again, and you can run it again, and things will work. Notice it didn't give an error for the input here. It didn't give an error until we got to that line. Remember that? I mean, it wasn't until I tried to enter a name that it had an error. And again, that's because of the interpreted nature. It goes line by line. In compiled code, that error would have happened before you ever even ran it. All right. So a couple of things I want to, I'm going to put them here in comments because that way they'll be in the blog too. What does a program consist of? I mean, this is about as simple as a program can get. There's 3 things I'm kind of looking for, and I don't expect you to know, but I'm just asking.
Can you repeat the question?
Well, the 3 things that go into the program itself. There's 3 parts. Any program, no matter how complicated, there's basically
Variable.
3 things. What?
Variable.
Well, so the variable is used basically.
Value,
yeah.
attribute.
Yeah, input is what I was looking for, right? There's stuff you put into the program. Stuff that comes in. It could come in like this, where you're entering it. It could come in from a file. It could come in from a database, right? But it's stuff that comes into the program. The third thing, which we have here, is output, right? So the output is hello and whatever that name is. In between them, process is a good word for it. I'm also going to call it, I'm going to put process, but also a technical term that they get into here is the algorithm. I'm not going to, in a computer science curriculum, there's usually like a whole course on algorithms. We're not going to do that. But an algorithm, go ahead.
No, I thought it was spelled with an I.
It may be. I am a horrible speller. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I do wise randomly. There are other words that I mess up that way a lot.
Do you also mess up pass versus fail?
What?
Do you also mess up like pass versus fail?
Why?
Because otherwise I just don't have to come to class.
Oh, no, I don't mix those up. I'm going to do a quick definition of algorithm, which is basically the steps need to do. Let's just do steps needed to accomplish a task in the order that they need to be taken. For most of what we're going to do, this is going to be really simple. But if they can get really complicated, right? An algorithm can be really complicated, but it's usually this. It's usually the steps that you need to do and the order in which they need to be done. Sometimes, like in an algorithm class, they might have you express that mathematically, but you don't have to. I mean, in the computer language, you wouldn't express it mathematically. There are famous algorithms that are actually kind of hard to come up with, like calculating a square root. You know, the way they teach you in school isn't particularly good for computers because in school they basically have you keep guessing. You know, these are, but there are algorithms for doing that. There's basically, how do you accomplish a task? If the task is simple, that's really easy. In our case, the algorithm is get the input, output, you know, the variable is printed out. 2 lines, nothing going on really. But as I said, as you get into more complex things, the algorithmic part becomes more of an issue. But every program basically has these 3 things. It has the inputs, it has the outputs, and it has the process, which another thing that processing does is it basically turns the inputs into outputs, right? You take data in, you do something with it, and then you put it out. That's basically what a computer program is. Input. So I'm going to do one other piece of this definition. Take inputs and turn them into the outputs. And again, conceptually that's simple. In practice, it can get difficult at times. Does that make sense, sort of? I'm going to do another little program with numbers, and then we'll talk about a couple of things. So I'm going to save this. Okay. I'm also going to, so I'm going to do a new file. I'm going to leave this one up, which may get confusing, but I'm going to do a new file. In this one, we're going to do a little bit of math, and it'll be similar. What do I want to do for math? Let's just do something where we do a real, like get a cube of something. I mean, really simple. I just want to show the pattern. We'll do a little bit more complex stuff in a moment. So I'm going to have the user enter an integer, and then we're going to output a cube of that integer. So a cube, you know, it's just it times itself 3 times. You guys know what an integer is?
Number.
Yeah, what kind of number?
Whole number?
It's a whole number, no decimal points. Right. Basically, Python has only got 2 numeric types, integer and float. Other languages have like dozens of variations of integer and dozens of variations of float, but Python keeps it really pretty simple. So I am going to do the def main again, because as I said, it's a good idea, colon. And I think when you're first working on this, the things that are probably doing the parentheses is that marks a function, even if there's no arguments. They all have the parentheses. And then the colon. The colon, if you forget that, then it doesn't indent right and it won't work. We're going to look at like a loop in a minute, because for whatever reason, he introduces loops right away. And it also has a colon. It marks the beginning of a block. So I am going to put, I'm just going to say number equals input, enter an integer. And then I'm going to say let's just do cube equals number times number times number. And I'm not going to worry about return right now because we could do it that way, but I'm going to just say print the cube is, and then I will just cube. All right, and then we'll call main. Okay, so does that make sense to you? How many of you have done programming on a computer with the asterisk is multiplication? Anybody not seen the asterisk used as multiplication? Okay, it's pretty common these days. Partially because you can't use an X. Computers aren't smart enough to figure out if you're using it as a letter or as a variable or as a multiplication symbol. And you can't not use a symbol. You know, like in algebra, you can just put two numbers side by side, and that's considered a multiplication. You can't do that because it has to have some hint as to what's going on. So they use this. We'll look at other number things too. This will fail if you run it, but I want to show you why it fails. So I'm going to save it. So I'm going to file, save as. I will call it cube pi. And we'll save it. And if I run it, all right, so it lets me do an integer. I'm going to do 4. Okay, so it fails there. Does anybody know why? I mean, it kind of tells you. The error message may not make much sense, though.
The cube is in integer.
Well, so it is an integer, but by default, if you just do input, it assumes a string. All right, so there's a couple of ways you can solve that. So this isn't, when we did the input, it isn't quoted. If you quote it, though, it's just going to do 4. It actually should, it'll probably fail on the multiplication. So one of the things you can do, and this is not the ideal way, you can put an eval. Now, what eval does is it says to evaluate the contents of the string to see if it can be turned into a number. And it should work now. So I'm going to save it. I will run it. I should just use the keystrokes. So I'm going to do the 4 again, and it works, right? 64. Now, eval is not considered your ideal way to do this because it's not particularly secure or whatever in there.
Wait, why didn't it work when you originally just put?
Because it expected a string, it expected a word.
Oh,
it didn't interpret the 4 as a
it wants a
number.
definition.
Yeah.
Already.
Now, this is a better way to do this. So eval works, but you can also do int, and then you're being very specific about what's coming in. This will crash if you put a float in there. If you put something with a decimal, it'll also crash if you put something in strings. But it's more precise than the eval, which just says is that the content numeric of any kind. Either one works, but this is considered a better option. So I'm going to save it, and then I'll run it. And it'll have exactly the same result.
Mine runs, but I don't get the output, an integer. I just get the interactive mode.
Oh, so are you in the other? Let's see what you got.
I'm on cube high.
Yeah, let's see what you got.
So I'm here.
Input. Oh, you haven't called main.
And how do you call it?
Right here at the
Oh,
bottom.
just.
Yeah.
Oh.
If you don't call main, it doesn't And when you run it, it has nothing to do, so it just gives you that empty interactive thing. It doesn't throw an error, it just gives you nothing, right?
But I do have to type in main.
You do. If you're using a function,
Mhm.
you have to call the function, right? If you're using a function, if you group it into a function,
Right.
again, the functions don't self-execute. If I just wrote this into the page itself, they would self-execute. But because I put them inside of a block function, it won't run that unless I actually call the function. And I could name that function anything and call it, but traditionally it's named main for the starting point. Unlike, again, I'm using languages you haven't played with, but unlike Java and C and other things, you don't have to start with main. They all do have to start with main. Here it's just traditional to start with main. You could start with any function name. And it would be exactly the same. You would just say def cube or something and then call cube. That makes sense? So int is better than eval. But you need, if you're using numbers, you need to have something there. You need to have eval or the type of number that you use. Because the input by itself assumes it's got quotes around it and it's a word. Does that make sense? Computers, I mean, Python makes a lot of assumptions for you. That makes it easier to use, but you know, it's not always obvious what the assumptions are. All right. Questions? Is this making some sense? The main purpose of today is just to sort of get you the feel of things.
So once you enter an integer, it's going to give you an error.
If you enter an integer, it shouldn't give you an error now. So if I run it, okay, do I need the stuff that's up there? I'm tempted to just write clear, not now, but in a minute, and it will clear that out. If I enter an integer, so if I enter 5, it will give me 125, right? If I run it again, one nice thing about loops is that you don't necessarily have to restart it every time. I'm going to do 2.5. What do you think that'll do? It'll throw an error because it's not an integer. If I used eval, it wouldn't throw an error, right? Because any number will work. It's just that eval is, if you look in the documentation, they don't recommend it, but it does work for any number. Right. I'm just going to real quickly in the comments say, when using numbers, use eval or number type. And there's only 2 number types in Python, int and float. So if I changed it to float, and run it, first I'll save it, and then if I run it, any number will work, because if you don't have a decimal point, it just assumes 0.0, right? So a whole number would work. But I could do a 2.5, despite the fact that it says enter an integer. It will process it just fine, because float, you know, it is a float. I'm going to take it back to int. But float and int are better than eval, just to let you know. I won't take off points for eval. But yeah.
Does a float always return? Would that always return a decimal?
It's a good question. Let's turn it back to float and try it with just like 3. It may return .0. Let's see.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if I do, yeah, so you already did it, but yeah, so it always returns a. We'll talk more about numbers later because with all computers, there's a few things that are a little bit weird, like integer division. Integer division always strips off any decimal part. So if you divide two integers, it'll ignore any parts. But you can get a remainder if you want. So we'll spend time later on the math. All right, I'm going to do one that's in the book, and then we're going to maybe do one together as the peer exercise thing. So I'm going to do another. You don't have to leave these all open if you don't want. They are saved, so I suppose I could close it. But I want a new file. And this one, what we're going to do in the book is they call it the chaos thing. It's on page, they call it the chaos program. So it's on page 613. And basically I want to show it because they're using a loop. And this author introduces loops fairly soon. And I just want to give you a feel for this. I don't expect all this to sink in. If you've programmed before, it might be pretty boring, but if you haven't programmed before, this stuff is kind of new and it can take some while to get the hang of it. So I'm going to do, I'll just do like chaos program. And I'm going to say that it's on page 13. So it'll be marked for that. And I'm going to do a def main. So a couple of things, as I said, I think I mentioned it before. White space like this doesn't matter. It does, the indentions do matter. And it is case sensitive. Like a capital main is not the same as a lowercase main, right? So it is case sensitive. Also, the naming convention in Python tends to be all lowercase. Just keep things in lowercase. Other languages have different naming conventions. Naming conventions don't really relate to you don't have to follow them for the programs to work, but every language has sort of its own default conventions. And it's useful to follow them, I think, in general. So in the book there, the first thing it does is it prints an explanation. This program illustrates a chaotic function, and it needs quotes. Poetic, chaotic. Okay. Notice when I did that, start the parentheses here, it gives me some IntelliSense. Depends on your environment whether it will. This is telling you some things that you can do in there. It may not necessarily be coherent to you at this point, but it basically says you can enter a value. I'm not sure what's, you can separate things with commas. If this will give you a line break, and this is, you can output a file, and you can, I'm not sure what flush is, I'll look that up. I think flush is part of outputting a file still. I mean, these are things you can do with the print function. It's not necessarily clear to you at this point, or to me, but it does give you some IntelliSense. If you use the Visual Studio Code, it does give you some IntelliSense too, and it gives you some possibilities for what will come next, right? All right, so I'm going to say x equals, and they have eval there. We could do that, but I think I'm going to do float. And then it'll be an input. And notice parentheses inside of parentheses. The other thing that will probably drive you nuts at different times is all of the different parentheses. But so we're going to enter a number between 0 and 1. may leave a space, which is a good idea. And he is using double quotes, I'm using single, but it doesn't matter in Python, as long as you're consistent beginning and end. Oh, I need one more parentheses. As I said, that's the part that'll probably... One of the things that if you press enter and it doesn't go back to where it's supposed to, that's probably a sign that something got left out. So this is the loop. I'm going to say for, and almost every language out there, programming language, has loops. And they usually have a for loop. And a for loop is what they call a counted loop. It's a loop that has a set number of iterations. Does that make sense? Almost things that all languages have basically are looping structures and selection structures, which are like if then. Okay. Right now we're just going to do the loop. And I'm going to say for 1, and basically 1 is the beginning, in range 10. So this is a little bit different syntax than if you've done JavaScript or something like that. So we're basically saying we're going to do 10 of these. We're going to do 10 loops. Does that make sense? The colon marks the beginning of the block. When I press enter, you'll see that we're indented again, right? Because this is a block inside of a block. You can have blocks inside of blocks inside of blocks, so your indentation can go correctly. I'm just going to do the math that he has here equals 3.9 times x times 1 minus x. Why did I put x's there? What did I do? 3.9. Oh, I know what I did. Times x times, I didn't hit the shift, I was hitting some other key. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And then we'll print x. Okay. So we have a main, and we're going to print this out. We're going to get a value for this value x, and then we're going to loop through this 10 times. So that basically means it goes through 1, does this, prints it, comes back out, does it for 2, does this, prints it, comes back out for 3, and it does it until it reaches 10. Does that make sense? It's one thing computers are really good at, is doing the same thing over and over again. It's one of their real skill sets. I'm going to do main again, because if I don't call main, nothing will happen. I'm going to save it. It won't run if you don't save. But I just did Control S to save it, but you can also do File Save. F5 will run it. Oh. Didn't I give it a name? I guess I did not.
Called Chaos 5.
Yeah, let's do that. I thought I had saved it beforehand, but I guess I did not. All right, so now it's saved. And then I can run it with F5. Did I get an error? Cannot assign to a literal. What do you mean cannot assign to a literal?
You have to put the 1 in brackets.
It's not a 1, it's an I.
Oh, that's, I typed. You're right, you're right. So let's stop the program. You have to do OK. It is an I. Because it's an iterator. It's just a variable to temporarily store whether you're at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I knew that, but it's been a while. So let's run it. Let's save it again, and then do F5. Okay. Now I still got an error. Or no, did I? No. Enter a number between 0 and 1. I have all that stuff on there. I should clear it off. but I was thinking you guys might want it in the blog, some of it. So I'm going to, between 0 and 1 means that it has to be like 0 point, anybody have a wild number?
25.
What?
125.
25 or 14? Well, we could do both. And so it prints these out, all 10 of them. The point of the chaotic function is that there's no predictable pattern. There are a lot of math functions that produce seemingly random results. Although if you enter the same number, you'll always get the same results. Right? If you enter 14, if you enter 25, you'll get the same results. If you enter 14, you'll get different results, but every time you enter the same number, you get the same results.
Mine says that main is not defined.
So when you did it, let's go back over here. So you have main parentheses, colon. Let's look real quick. Oh, but it's capital.
I did it with the lowercase.
Here.
Yeah, that's it.
So it does the, these have to match, and they have to match in case, and it takes a while to get the hang of that. I'm a random capitalizer myself, so. Questions on that? I'm not sure I yeah.
When I try to run it, I got a expected and indented block.
So are you indented? Let's look. Yeah. Yeah. So, as I said, in Python, this indentation matters. It's how it tells. This is what tells Python that this belongs to this function, and this is what tells it that it belongs to this loop. The indentation matters. To me, that's weird too, actually. After years of programming in other languages, it's kind of weird to use indentation for the marker. On the other hand, it's easier, particularly since it indents for you. It makes typing much faster. One of the reasons why Python is so popular is that you can really develop fairly quickly. Yeah.
So the letter I indicates the integer.
It's basically just a counter, so it doesn't have to be the letter I here. So I could do, I don't want to use X because we're using that as a variable, but I could do,
Do a symbol.
I could do, no, you can't do a symbol. I could do M though, and it should work just fine. It has to be a letter, or at least begin with letters. You're not allowed to use a naming. It's essentially a variable. It's essentially like this is X, this is an M, and what it is storing is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It stores which loop you're on. It stores the value, the counter. In fact, let's do that. I could name it counter. Because that's what it's doing. It's basically storing the count. And then if I run it, so let's do the 14. 0.14. And it runs that just fine. So counter, it's kind of an arbitrary variable. I is common for it because it's basically an integer. It's short for integer, right? So I is a real common variable for the loop counter. But there's nothing that makes it that so you have to say I. And you can use the counter. Let's do counter X here. What do you think that'll do? So if I do F5, I'm way down there again. Let's do 0.11. Notice it gives me the actual count, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. computers tend to count from zeros. Start with zeros. Does that make sense? So I put this is the counter, this is the value from the equation. I could put more space.
To chaos, so I can see it.
Sure.
Bring the counter X.
And if you had it as I, you could just put IX, right?
And it will still give you the numbers?
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't matter. If I change counter back to I would just do, so I, and then I could just do this too. As long as they match, it'll do exactly the same thing. See, it's got the counter numbers along the side. Interesting. So the thing about the loop here is the counter, you have to have a counter in there, but whether you name it doesn't matter at all.
But that's the loop for I in range 10.
Right. So this is basically for whatever the counter is until it reaches 10.
10.
Yeah. Except it won't reach 10, it reaches 9.
Right. Well, but if you start
It has
from
10
zero,
of them, yeah. It's the number of things, not the actual count. There are variations on this. We'll worry about them later. And there are other kinds of loops. There are while loops as well. But. Okay. So I think because we just did this program, I'm going to bring up the peer programming thing. So the peer assignment 1, which I have shared with you, I believe. And the idea is to work together with somebody. How would you modify the chaos program so that the user determines how many values to print? So the trick is, let's go back to the main. So I need the chaos pi. The trick is, this is set hard-coded to 10. How would you make it so that it goes more than 10 or less than 10, whatever the user wants to? So go ahead and just see if you can figure something out first, and then we'll go over it. We'll. I want to give you. Like, how long do you need? 10 minutes? 15? Just modify the program so that the user can determine. And it's, as I said, you can't. As long as you do something, and I'll show you how to upload it. You get the points. Doesn't matter if you get it right. And we will go over it so you'll know what the right answer is. I just want you to think about it for a minute. And while you do that, I'm going to go do some this. But it's good if you work. If you want to do it solo, you can. But I think it works best if you talk to somebody near you. Be right back.
It says modify so that the user determines the number of.
What's asking is, so you know how we can get 10 results. It's asking you to how would you change it so that you can outside of the results you want. So if you want 5, how would you define it?
Oh, outside.
Well, how I did it was I made a separate info statement.
Right. All you did was
Just saying enter number of values, and then attaching that to a variable. Y. And variable. Yeah, but instead of a print statement, you would want it to be an if statement. And then you're going to put that actually above or because you need it to
you gotta add something else.
Yeah.
So just right, yeah.
Otherwise you won't run.
Also like,
Yeah, I did.
And then you want to attach that to a variable, just like you have on that first one.
You've done some programming.
You can,
Although,
it
yeah,
can be, it can be like
like,
whatever you want.
Didn't really
but
translate to
mine-
SQL classes, but it's translating this to
Yeah. SQL's a little bit different than the other
The way I
programming.
did it
Different
is
syntax,
you,
yeah.
you don't have to make a separate
Yeah,
quote.
you
All
essentially
you have
want
to
to
do is
change
the counter
turn
well, you
I just have a question.
a variable name.
For, because I did get it to work, but would I need to put eval or like integer for my next one?
Yes, you would.
I would, okay. I wasn't sure if I needed.
Yeah,
that.
they're independent, but that's true. That's
You
correct.
basically want to do that same kind of idea with range available for range. So that then,
And
let's
just
say
like
they want
the other one, it's going to
make
just by default read it as a string, so you change it to that as an integer. So wrap the equal statement in.
Yeah, basically,
Doing that, so it's
range into a variable is essentially just write the same file. If you
I
get
think
a variable.
I'm just playing with it, right? I mean, it's changed here. Right. So we changed everything.
So the last thing you want to do now is, so for counter here, 10 rather than. Because you're gonna put the number.
Right, so if I said input,
And then, yeah.
but no, you gave me an error. All right.
Yeah. And so try running it full through this little. And then.
So I might run it down. Right.
So this is, that's input. We need
So you start with whatever.
So it's say like,
Just read on it.
so I gotta create a, let's say, Y.
Yeah.
But he didn't, it wasn't concerned.
You might say,
You can use it.
We should also have.
You're good.
Yeah.
Zero and two.
No, it's the number of results you get. So you're.
It's confusing, but yeah. But
Yeah.
This is the number.
So like the big thing that changed was. So it didn't buy 10. And then, yeah, 10.
Before we got 10 results
Yeah,
back.
exactly. So all you're doing is really you're just
The number that.
Yeah, that's a big.
Yeah. Thank you.
Value error is value error for int. And base 10.
And that input statement is, a number, the number that's.
So this is the loop. I'm telling it, run the loop program. This goes, ranges, right? So the first one is enter 0, 1. And the second one is 0 and 2.
Yeah.
So by default, the input is.
I didn't tell how many times I was.
And so, you can't multiply the string by. And so that's what the purpose of the is. that wants to, you want it to understand this number.
And then it's gonna run.
As if people are.
Now it's at 0.1.
Exactly.
And then
So
the
like,
second
yeah,
one
like
is
I'll
gonna
just
be
remove
0.2.
mine.
Oh, no. Oh, invalidated for entry.
So you get an error, the string object cannot be interpreted as an integer. So it's just telling you that the input that you can't do what you want it to do. It's gonna multiply the string by. Did you already finish?
I did.
Okay.
I did it while I was talking.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I did it. Sending it from- Have you done programming before?
I tried teaching myself before I started this. It's actually, it's not too bad with math, and you can make your computer do math for you. Yeah. It's just like remembering all the concepts and stuff. The math is where I'm skittish about it, but the more I try it, the more
Yeah, that scene with comedy that was basically like why trying to figure out where how good time.
Yeah.
So we're gonna have to write it.
There's like a million ones.
Okay, good.
There are, but like right now, there's we haven't gone.
So I changed this, so I had it in one, so for integer, it wouldn't run, it kept telling me about the base. So I just put eval and then it ran it. Evaluate.
No, you want to create a different variable?
Yeah, right. But I understood which one is how, which number. So I did run this, but I don't know which one.
Type Y.
It did run.
Y. No, just Y.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
So with the
Equals
here,
input,
but with INT, you kept giving me this error.
enter how
There
many
is a
values.
little for INT with base 10.
Yeah,
You
enter how many values.
But you can't.
Because you want to prompt them as to
Integer.
to enter how
That's why I
many
wasn't
times they want to.
Nothing wrong with your
So then,
program.
yeah, they'll cool them.
The integer has to be a whole number.
Right.
Are you guys ready to go over it? Do you need some more time?
Instead of 10,
You guys are
you put Y.
good. I saw most, how are you guys in the back? I didn't get back there. Doing okay? How would you do it?
You need another input.
Yeah, basically you need another input, right? You need to ask the user how many loops they want to do. I've been just doing Y because they're doing X, but you can do whatever. The variable name doesn't matter. And actually, X and Y are not necessarily great variable names. It's really good if your variable names kind of explain what they're doing, but I'll do Y for now anyway. You need to do eval or int. One of the problems a couple of people had was to do float again. Basically, the reason why that's a problem is that we're going to substitute this variable for the 10, and the argument for range has to be an integer. Yeah.
Hey, why do you have the in print? Why is the I there?
The I is a counter, right?
Okay, so if that's not there, then, my, stuff won't be.
You're right. Basically, this is just the syntax for a loop. For I, and down here, this doesn't have to be here down here. This, is that what you're asking about for down
Yeah.
here? That doesn't have to be there. It just numbers at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I just wanted to show you that you could do that. It's not part of the necessarily. I'm just going to copy the input here. I'm going to change it, but one of the things that I would suggest at some points is that copy and paste is really nice so you don't have to type so much. So instead of this, I'm going to say enter the number of loops, or whatever you want. I'm going to say the number of loops. And then here, as most, if I put a Y there, so it's a counted loop, and it needs to have a value, but that value can be stored in a variable. Right, so we're going to do, when I do range Y, it's going to ask me how many loops do I want to do, and then I can do that. So I'm going to save this. Questions on that so far? The trick is you need another input, right? You need to get the user's input for how many loops. And we need to then change the loop itself so that it reflects that number of loops. Couple of things that you can't just put Y here because if you haven't given it a value beforehand, right? It has to have a value before you can use it in the loop. What the loop requires here is an integer value. It can be stored, it can be literally just typed in, like if I wanted to do 20 loops, I could type 20. Or it can be stored in a variable, but it has to be an integer value. Does that make sense? When I don't make sense, let me know. And stuff that makes sense to some of you may not make sense to others. It depends somewhat on experience. And so I don't know if I saved it, so I'm going to save it again. Run it. We're way down there. So I still have to enter a number. Yeah. The in?
Yeah.
Well, it's just part of the syntax
Okay.
of the for, so I'm not sure what it. So a for loop will always look pretty much like that for some number, for some variable in some range. So I have no idea why that, but let's do that. And let's just do 5 loops. So it does 5 loops, 0 to. And if I were to run it again, I could put in, the user can put in however many loops they want to run. Questions on that one? Does that make sense, sort of? What doesn't make sense, I guess? Whether about this or just about Python so far. Yeah.
You don't have to define I, like, I know the counter, but like, what's...
You actually don't have to define it here. Again, Python, these are things that when you've done Java and JavaScript and things like that can drive you nuts. But yeah, it just assumes it's an integer variable in that context. Whatever you put there will be an integer variable, and it's assigned. What's assigned to it is whatever number you are in the range, right? So in loop, the first loop I is 0. In the second loop it's 1. In the third loop it's 2. And again, whatever variable you maybe put there will work. And in other languages, you'd have to define this as an int and give it an initial value. But you don't have to in Python. As I said, these are things that can drive you nuts if you're used to other languages. Yeah.
One more definition of the word of float.
So float is any number that has decimals.
Okay.
right? So integer is a number with no decimal parts. And a float is any number that has decimals. For what it's worth, other languages have multiple float versions. They have doubles, they have numeric, they usually have multiple. But Python keeps it simple. Anything that has decimals is a float. Anything that doesn't have decimals is an integer. Yeah.
What's the definition of a for loop?
So a for loop is a counted loop, which means that there's always a definite value here, even though it may have come in by way of variable. That makes sense. So there's always a numbered number of loops. There's another type of loop we'll deal with later called while loops. And while loops basically are based on a Boolean. They will loop until some condition is true. So they'll keep looping. There's no set number for the number of loops. They just loop until some condition is
So
true.
you have many loops.
You can have many loops.
For loops, while loops.
Actually, in Python, there's just two kinds of loops. There's for and while.
Oh.
Yeah. Other languages are more loops, but they actually all break down into variations of for and while loops anyway. So Python just abstracted them, so there's just for loops and while loops. And they made it flexible enough that basically all those other kinds of loops are incorporated. Does that make sense? That's why it's a high-level language. I mean, it's basically simplified everything it can. And it's why it's actually easier to learn than some of the others. Because you don't have to learn so many particular versions of things. It tends to incorporate them all together. When we talk about lists, other languages have like dozens of structures that do what Python lists do. Other questions? These are good questions. I want you to understand it. I don't want it just to be. Any other questions about these? So, a couple of things. Variable names are arbitrary. You can name them whatever you want, right? The ideal is to name them something that actually will mean something to you, especially as programs get more complicated. If all your variables are X and Y and Z and A and B, C or something, it can be really confusing as to what's going on when the program gets complicated. So it's better to name them something that means something. So in some ways, counter is a better name than I. I is real traditional. I mean, it's sort of what everybody names it, but counter is actually telling you what it's doing. It's counting the number of loops. I don't know what this X and Y here. You could say that this. I mean, sometimes I just use number, and you could call that number of loops if you wanted. You know, as a variable name. Wordy. There's nothing that prevents you from being more wordy. The only time that matters is if you're programming for something that is really tight on space, memory space, which can happen. More and more people are programming for dashboards, devices, and some computer chip in a refrigerator or something. There, your resources may be more limited, and it may make more sense to be really tight on the definitions of things.
Can you use a space in a variable, or does it have to be like all word?
You cannot. That's actually a good question. You can't have any spaces. So in a variable name, it has to start with something between A and Z. It has to start with an alpha numeric character or an underscore. It is possible to start with an underscore, although that's usually reserved for certain kinds of system variables. The underscore, but you can't do that. You're not allowed to have any spaces. If you want to break words up, you can do underscores between them. All right. I think Python allows hyphens between words too. I'd have to check that out. But some of the system variables have hyphens. You're not allowed to use things like an at or an exclamation point or symbols. Most of those symbols are forbidden. Usually you want it to be letters or numbers. You can have numbers in a variable, and You can have underscores, possibly hyphens. I'll check on that. But typically, you just run the words together.
So if you're programming in a different language, would that matter?
So actually, these are pretty common across all programming languages. Yeah.
No, what I meant, it's like a spoken, not a computer language, but like a different language.
Oh, you know what? This is weird in a lot of ways, but if you were writing Python in China, you would be writing it in English.
In English.
Yeah. If you were writing, this is true of most languages, for whatever reason, are in English. If you write C in Germany, you're still going to write it in English. Now, I've been curious about this actually. There's got to be a few languages that are being written in other languages by this point, because there's no logical reason why that has to be. It's just that the language has evolved here, and they've stayed here. I mean, they've stayed in English. I have a book. It's not for Python, but it's for SQL, which is a database program. I have a book in Japanese. The whole text is in Japanese, but all the code samples are just straight English. Yeah. Yeah.
Since Japanese, isn't it traditionally like top to bottom or whatever, that's written in a different order?
Yeah.
Or it-
But if you wrote a compiler to read it, then
then yeah.
yeah.
Well, anything with science or technology related,
Printed in the Western order.
Yeah, generally they are. I mean,
you have to.
partially it's the computers originated here, and most of the code languages originated here, but I'm not sure there's a logical reason why you couldn't.
I mean, you could, but the thing is, you have to consider the coding, as in the encoding, The
Well,
encoding
so
stuff like
so you'd
that.
have to use you'd have to write it would probably be more complicated to write a compiler.
Well, true. I mean, I have seen it, but
I'm sure there has to be some programming in other languages
Yeah.
that are this. But typically, like Python is going to be English wherever you go. C, the other languages are mostly English wherever you go. Even if,
Probably like my point was like if, for example, the for loop
yeah.
in a different language would be named and written differently,
Um,
or it's still the same syntax, the same structure.
so don't,
Become
this would be a for loop in JavaScript for int I equals 0. I is less than 10 if we're doing 10 loops. I plus plus. That's a for loop actually in Java, in JavaScript, in C#, in a lot of languages. That's what a for loop looks like. I have argued before that maybe Python shouldn't be the first language you learn because it is so simplified and it's much easier to learn, but then you get a little bit of a culture shock when you go into this. But this is a for loop in, as I said, in Java, JavaScript, and C#, and dozens of other languages. They're all C-based. It's the same concept, except the I has to be declared. So it's int I, and again, it could be count or it could be anything. And you have to give it an initial value. Here it's just assumed. You have to say where the end is, and this could be Y, right? It could, for I is less than Y. So you have to give it a terminal condition. This is called an iterator, and what it does is it's saying that every loop I is added, one is added to I. So you start at 0, the first loop at 0. When you come back, it's plus 1. Next time it's plus another 1, plus 1 until so it keeps adding to I until I is, as long as I is less than 10. When I equals 10, then the loop is over. Curly braces mark the block instead of the intention. But that's not how Python, the concept is the same. It's actually doing exactly the same thing. It's just the syntax is different. So that's the question. I thought you meant like in what it would look like in Russian or something. Do you want that in the notes? I could comment it so it's still there. I don't know if you need it. We'll never do another one of those in here. But if you're doing JavaScript right now, you'll be doing loops like that. Other questions? Okay. I want to do one other thing. So first of all, we did this. This is the my brain is gone. I'm going to save this. This is the pure exercise. So I'm going to save this. In here, I'm going to go down. You guys don't have to do this. I am going to go into student view because I am not in student view. Student view. All right. So we have, this is coming up, pure assignment. So you can submit this. And there's a lot of things you can do. There's text entry, there's a website URL, Google Drive, Office 365. So you could do a file. I mean, you could load the file. If I browse, I could go to ITC 110 and I could do chaos, right? That's what we did.
Yeah.
And you can upload it that way, which is perfectly fine with me. You can also go to idle, let's do the chaos. You can just copy this and you can do like a text entry. The only thing the text entry won't do, notice how it messes up your indentation. I think you could, I don't know if you want to bother. Because what I will do if you do the text is I will assume your indentions were good. But if you want to, on a simple one, you could do that. And then you can submit it that way. Or if you really want, you could copy it and paste it in a Google Doc and give it a link to that. If you do the Google Doc, share it with me. Share it with whoever has the link. But for the most part, I would just upload the file or just paste the code into the text box. One of the two. And I do this because I will grade this. But again, for the peer exercises, you just get the points for turning it in. Right or wrong, it doesn't matter. I just want you to try it. And turning it in as evidence that you were here.
What about the quiz?
We can do the quiz right now if you want. We'll do it together. Normally we won't, but I will do the quiz together. All right. And if you decide you want to do something different, you can resubmit, But again, these pure assignments, just turn something in and you get the points. For the quiz, let's go back to the assignment. Well, let's go back to home. And it says that the quiz is there. So let's do the quiz. So I said normally, let me zoom back a little bit. So it's big enough, but not. So let's take the quiz. This one we'll do together. All right, so there's 3 tries, right? So there's only 4 answers per question. There's 5 questions, 4 answers per question. So there's no particular reason you shouldn't get them perfect, right? So which of these inputs can best be defined as information that the program displays, information that must be provided to the program, the steps or sequence in which things could be? Which one is best defined as input?
Information must be provided?
Yeah, so it's the information that must be provided. Okay. And then the second one is the best definition for output. Which one of those is the best definition for output? The first one, okay, information that the program displays. Then the algorithm. They all have the same answers, so you're just choosing a different one each time. Yeah, the steps in the sequence. The steps in the sequence or in sequence that must be taken to solve a programming problem. And then for the usual starting place, main, right? And this one is as tricky as they get. Which are true of Python? It is a high, yeah, it's all of the above. It's a high-level programming language. It's interpreted. Python program is a sequence of commands, so it's all of the above. And then when you submit that, so let's go down, submit quiz, and so we got 5 out of 5. And it goes through and it shows you for each question that it's correct or it's not correct. So if you make a mistake, you can fix it. So we have 2 things in, all right? If you want, let's look at the first assignment really quickly. So let's go back to assignments. Now the first assignment isn't due for a while, and I may give some more practices for it, but if you really want to work on it, it's basically chapter 2.1. Add an introduction to the convert program. There's a program in part 2, which we might do together next time, which is convert, I think it's to convert Fahrenheit to Celsius or vice versa. You can do both if you want. We could talk about how to do this. And this one is to modify the average program. And again, these are both in chapter 2. And I will talk about them a bit on Tuesday. I'm trying to remember what days we meet. And then I will try to give you some in-class time to work on these as well. But you're welcome to look at them. I would suggest if you can, and you can use the book, you can use some of the problems in here are fairly math intensive. I've kind of avoided those, but if you're not too math phobic, you could try some of them. You can also just try programs on your own. Just do simple things that you want to look at examples of this and maybe make your own little programs. The more you play with it, the more you work with it, the easier it will be. If you only do the assignments, you can probably get through it and do okay. But if you really want to get it into your brain so it lasts, you want to play with it as much as you can. And do treat it as play. It can be frustrating when it doesn't work, but it's a learning experience, and you can fix it. And then when it does work, it's fairly exhilarating sometimes, particularly if you struggle with it for a while. But you're not going to hurt anything. You're not losing anything. You're just maybe tired. But you can, playing with it, trying to figure out why something isn't working. Look at the error messages. Look for examples in the book or online. There are thousands and thousands of tutorials online. The other thing I'll mention about the assignment, and again, you don't have to start it, there's always an extra credit. I think I explained that. When you look at the rubrics, there's an extra credit and it's worth 0 points. But if you do it, I will put points there. So the whole assignment is worth 10 points. If you do the extra credit, it might be worth 15 points. Does that make sense? You don't lose points by not doing it, but you can gain points by doing it. Again, it's partially to encourage you to play with it more. And if it doesn't make sense, the more you play with it, eventually it starts to make sense. But it can be eventual. It isn't necessarily right away. All right. So we're a few minutes early, but not a lot early. So I'm going to say we're done. Do you guys have any questions? So I will post the code that we did in class on the blog. The video I will put in the playlist. What I have is YouTube playlists. And there's a playlist for every class. And it'll be at the top. Let me kill the video too. Probably could have been killed sooner.